Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are in Song of the Exposition, passages 8-9. We are now going to finish this classic poem. I consider it a classic. To me, it's one of the great statements in all of Leaves of Grass of Whitman as patriot. That is to say, he's going to celebrate America and the American flag. Now, obviously, there are readers of this poem that will see this way over the top. I'm going to leave that one up to you as we get ready to start. It's often called the great Behold passage. We're going to see why 6 times, along with the 2 times of Mark or Watch. Now, the assumptions are that you've been with us at learnstrong.net on that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and you've worked with us from the inscriptions all the way through. We've been reading everything through Leaves of Grass right up to now this passages 8-9, as we will treat them together as a unit. I want you to notice all of the capital letters and just start underlining them as we finish this. And as well, we're going to argue this is Whitman's theodicy. Go back to earlier lecture, we talked about our big 5 theodicy. Why did bad things have to happen? Especially, of course, for us, it will be in American history, the horrific Civil War of 1861 to 65. Of course, this is a poem from delivered in 71. He begins direct, and thou, America. And again, so important that when he mentions America, that we kind of sit up and take notice. Thy offspring, towering ever so high, yet higher, thee above all towering. So in other words, America is the greatest country in the history of the world. That's going to be Whitman's argument right from the beginning. The exclusivity of America. Although borrowing heavily from Europe, transcending and including, as we said in earlier lectures. And then notice all the capital letters here. With victory on thy left, and at thy right hand law. We get something like this, we can't help but think of our Virgil's Aeneid, book 6, and of course the discussion between Aeneas and his father Anchises down in the underworld, where he says that the greatest thing that Rome will ever give is law. We've given full lectures, of course, on the Aeneid at learnstrong.net. Thou, union, capitalized, holding all, fusing and absorbing, tolerating all. This is a key word, tolerating, obviously. Thee ever I sing. And so it's as if what Whitman wants to do is to set up his readers and obviously his listeners. I'm about to sing a song of how great America is. America is the most amazing country, right? America, the beautiful. Thou also, thou a world. So notice we go from America now to the rest of the world. With all thy wide geographies, manifold, different, distant, rounded by thee in one. You'll remember it's Rondur at the conclusion of passage 7. Dash, one common orbic language, one common indivisible destiny for all. So I find this fascinating. And we're going to see this again in passage to India. That for Whitman, everything now will be about how America is the great leader in the world. And of course, his patriotism now will just begin to spill out everywhere. And by all the spells which ye vouchsafe to those your ministers in earnest, I here personify and call my themes to make them pass before ye. Notice the use of the word ye. For those of us who have read our Moby Dick, we know this use of that word, right? Behold, and then we're going to get a number of these beholds. Behold, America, and thou ineffable guest and sister, obviously the muse. For thee come trooping up. By the way, notice all the martial language, the war language that gets used here. Up thy waters and thy lands, behold thy fields and farms, thy far-off woods and mountains, as in procession coming. So in other words, now we're going to get a procession. Again, this is why some people had difficulty with this poem right from the beginning. It's Whitman over the top. But what is it? It's almost like a procession, like a July the 4th procession, if you will, okay? And let me just tell you why America, and it's almost like he's speaking to the world. Let me tell you why America is the most amazing country in the history of the world. Now, it is true that there is a huge debate today about how much celebration that we should have for America because of our history. Whitman would look at us and say, read my passage. Because I'm going to go both directions. I'm going to talk about the horrors of American history, for him especially the American Civil War. And I'm going to talk about the majesty of America as well. Why can't we balance both in our vision of America? That for Whitman is patriotism. Look how he plays the game. Behold, the sea itself, and on its limitless heaving breast the ships. See where their white sails bellying in the wind sparkle the green and blue. See the steamers coming and going, steaming in and out of port. See dusky and undulating the long pennants of smoke. So in other words, we got ships going all over the globe. How amazing is that? Behold in Oregon, Okay, we're kind of close out here in Wyoming, aren't we? Behold in Oregon, far in the north and west, or in Maine. So notice he's going both sides of the country. Far in the north and east, thy cheerful axemen wielding all day their axes. This takes us back to Song of the Broadaxe. In other words, we're going to have a romanticized, although he's an anti-romantic, right? He said it himself. He's going to romanticize the idea that you got lumbermen and women out there working in the woods, cutting down trees. Of course, for the environmentalists, we're all going to look at this and say, wait a minute, what about the deforestation? For Whitman, he's not going to pay any attention to that at all. Some of the environmental concerns, we're going to hear about factories and fire, and he's going to celebrate that whole idea. And this will also be a knock on this part of the poem. But he's just going to celebrate the fact that America is a land of natural resources that we have extracted to build and create this amazing country. Behold, one more, on the lakes, thy pilots at their wheels, thy oarsmen, how the ash rides under those muscular arms. We've seen this image of the muscular arms. By the way, notice all the exclamation points as well. There by the furnace, and there by the anvil, behold thy sturdy blacksmiths. We've seen this image several times already in Leaves of Grass. Swinging their sledges, overhead so steady, overhead they turn and fall with joyous clank, like a tumult of laughter. It's an interesting simile, right? The idea that you got blacksmiths hammering away, and that it's joyous and a tumult of laughter. And yet, this is his point. In other words, when I look at America, he says, I can't help but just be blown away by everything that's happening. The work, the labor that's happening. Mark means, of course, look or watch. The spirit of invention. Now, this is key. And this is, I think, key to reading Song of Exposition. For Whitman, America is the great country of invention. And once we stop being that for Whitman, we're no longer a great country. So the spirit of invention everywhere. Thy rapid patents, thy continual workshops, foundries, risen or rising, see from their chimneys how the tall flame fires stream. Well, obviously we would ask, well, yeah, but what about the pollution? And obviously Wordsworth was already asking this across the Atlantic in England about some of the concerns that were there. This will take us back to our comments on Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, passage 9. Remember, burn high your fires at the conclusion of that poem. We made the same comment. Whitman here is just going to celebrate the fact that with all these fires burning out of all these chimneys, we have industry. And industry is going to be the great building of America. Mark, another one. Thy interminable farms, north, south, thy wealthy daughter states, eastern and western, the varied products of Ohio. We're going to have 5 of them. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Georgia, Texas, and the rest. And we've seen this before, where he lists several states to encompass all of America. Thy limitless crops, he mentions now grass, obviously Leaves of Grass comes to mind, wheat, sugar, oil, corn, rice, hemp, hops. Thy barns are filled, the endless freight train and the bulging storehouse, the grapes that ripen on thy vines, the apples in thy orchards. Now the fact that he uses the word thy, and it was already falling out of parlance. It was Puritan language, right? And it was already falling out of parlance. What's going on? Well, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He's referencing those passages from the Bible that talk about the area of Israel as a nation flowing with milk and honey. You'll remember this from Exodus 3:8, from Numbers 14:8, and of course Deuteronomy 31:20. He's playing a similar kind of game. In other words, without saying it, what is he saying? Well, America's the new Israel, right? And of course this was a trope that was used often during Whitman's time, a city set on a hill and all of that. Notice, thy incalculable lumber, beef, pork, potatoes, thy coal, thy gold and silver, the inexhaustible iron in thy mines. And of course we would argue whether in fact our natural resources are inexhaustible, but for Whitman, and it makes sense given what so much of America had yet to have been explored, some would argue exploited, he's going to say it's inexhaustible, right? All thine, O sacred Union. And he waxes very patriotic now for the final lines at the end of 8 and all of 9. Ships, farms, shops, barns, factories, mines, notice 6. City and state, north, south, item and aggregate, we dedicate, dread mother, all to thee. So now, of course, mother capitalized. We're talking about mother country, right? Protectress absolute, thou. Bulwark of all. Notice all meaning maybe the rest of the nations of the world. And of course, this is prophetic to some degree as we follow what happens later in the 20th century, especially with our 2 world wars, right? And the need for America to help in many ways save the world. So here, protectorate of all, he'll bulwark of all. For well we know that while thou givest each and all, generous is God, without thee neither all, nor each, nor land, home, nor ship, nor mine, nor any here this day secure, nor aught, nor any day secure. It mentions the word secure twice. We're going to come back to it in passage 9. In other words, it's hard for us as postmoderns to wrap our brain around what had to have been the climate of the day. That nervousness about, okay, the Civil War ended, but man, that was a pretty nasty 4 years. Unbelievable what we did to each other. Are we safe? Are we secure as a nation? And notice you'll have the optimism that will be central to Whitman's view. And now we come to passage 9. Because you've got your own copy, underline every time there's a capital to begin a word, and underline all of the exclamation points, and you'll figure out exactly what Whitman is doing here. And thou, the emblem waving over all, like Song of the Broad Axe 10 and 11. Now we've got the celebration of the flag itself. Delicate beauty, a word to thee, and then again in parentheses, we started with these parenthetics, it may be salutary. And of course it is going to be salutary. In other words, saluting the flag. This is going to be Whitman saluting the flag. So here we go. Remember, and I think that's a key word. I think so much of Song of the Exposition, and people who don't like this poem, I often will remind them, this is Whitman already as he's getting older. He is trying to remind Americans, remember. Remember that when you look at the flag, it is a symbol that has a history to it already by obviously 71. Remember thou hast not always been here as today, so comfortably ensovereigned. In other scenes than these have I observed the flag. Of course, he will have his first exposure in 62 when he goes to visit his brother in a hospital in D.C., as we commented in earlier lectures. About the flag, he says, there was another time, not quite so trim and whole and freshly blooming in folds of stainless silk, but I have seen thee bunting, to tatters torn upon thy splintered staff. We're going to get more of this in drum taps later, the section drum taps of Leaves of Grass. Or clutched to some young color bearer's breast with desperate hands, savagely struggled for life or death, fought over long, mid cannon's thunder crash, and many a curse and groan and yell, and rifle volleys cracking sharp, and moving masses as wild demons surging, and lives as nothing risked, for thy mere remnant, grimmed with dirt and smoke and sopped in blood, for sake of that, my beauty, and that thou mayest dally as now, secure up there, many a good man have I seen go under. Now, this is some compelling poetry. It's obviously, some would argue, propaganda. But there's no question, it is celebratory. But it's also Milton, I say Milton because it's fresh in my mind of considering the question of theodicy. But it's Whitman's theodicy. That is to say, why does terrible things have to happen, like the American Civil War? Why must young men go and die, and their last dying breath is clutching that flag sopped in blood? It's going to be for security, right? That is to say, what we now have, Whitman will argue, in this burgeoning America was necessarily a product of that horrific war. It's the way that he's going to argue, his theodicy will argue. By the word, that word savage takes us back to passage 7 and some of the things that he said back there as well. Of course, the great hope is that somehow America will be able to learn through this experience. And now to the final lines of Song of the Exposition. Now, here, and these, and hence in peace. Again, I told you, an important word, right? All thine, O flag. By the way, do you remember at the end of starting from Pamanach, at the end of the inscriptions we saw starting from Pamanach, in passage 15, that repetition of O. Here we are. We're coming now to the end of his song, his chant. And here and hence for thee, O universal muse, been mentioned several times in this poem, and thou for them, and here and hence, O union, notice capitalized, all the work and workmen thine, none separate from thee, the inclusivity of Whitman. Notice the dash. Henceforth, one only, we and thou. In other words, this idea that America is this amazing country, culture, where we have all these many disparate kinds of cultures, but somehow united. And for Whitman, this is important. And then, in a line that maybe is the most compelling line of all of Song of the Exposition, it's set off in parenthetics. Look how he says it. For the blood of the children, what is it? Only the blood maternal. And the lives and works, what are they at last, except the roads to faith and death? Now this is, of course, going to make us immediately reminded of those final lines of Song of Myself, passage 6. the beautiful uncut hair of graves. And that idea that somehow his theodicy will explain the death of children by virtue of necessity to provide us what we now have in 1871 as modeled by this exposition. It's an interesting idea as well to point out that when children die, they don't, especially if they're female children, they don't get to become mothers, and therefore, as the children die, they are maternal. It's a compelling word picture. He finishes now with the last lines. While we rehearse, and I think that remembering or that rehearsing is central, I think Whitman believed that Leaves of Grass was a way for American school children to remember the past. And certainly we've been approaching it as we've studied Leaves of Grass from that's one perspective. While we rehearse our measureless wealth, of course measureless and to be measured, you'll take us back to Song of Myself, passage 46. I know I have the best of time and space. It was never measured, never will be measured. This idea of measureless. America is going to have no limits. Measureless wealth. It is for thee, again, dear mother, notice capitalized mother. We owe it to all and several today, indissoluble in thee. Think not our chant, our show, merely for products gross or lucre. For Whitman, America and American industry is not first and foremost about money, about wealth. It is for thee, the soul in thee, electric, spiritual. It's an interesting idea. In the end, what makes America great for Whitman is not that the factories produce all of the stuff that can be sold and therefore we can be this financially rich country, but rather the fact that we're all creating together and we're all working together, and because of that we share in this common electric spiritual unity. It's an interesting idea. Our farms, and now the final list, inventions, crops, we own in thee. Again, he's speaking specifically of the flag as being representative. Cities and states, in thee. Our freedom, all, in thee. Our very lives, in thee. Well, the poem is a compelling poem, and the way this poem ends, I mean, many of readers have said, dude, this is just totally over the top. Are you serious with me right now? But I would say, if you're going to understand America and American thought and American culture, you have to appreciate America's greatest poet, Walt Whitman. And I think in Song of the Exposition, he is reminding us that America is built around this unbelievable idea of innovation and curiosity and wonder and the celebration of that. To just finish now at 2A, well, our nation's history. For Whitman, let's make sure this is not blind optimism. He points out the horrors of our history, but he also points out that out of those horrors came this amazing culture, and we have to be proud of that culture. Whitman would not understand any American voice today that would say, I cannot be proud of my country because of the horrors of the past. Whitman wouldn't understand that. He would say, no, 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 you don't understand. It's the horrors of the past. Some young man dying, holding on to a flag in the middle of a battlefield. That horror, that savagery is the language he uses, was necessary for all that was to come. It's a compelling idea. At 2B, of course, the language here of passion, of enthusiasm. You can see it with capital letters. You can see it with the exclamation point. There have been some who've been asked, where would you like to go if you could go back to one place in time? And some have said, I'd like to go back and hear him actually deliver this speech. If I could be close enough to hear it, how at the end especially he became so passionate about the country and about the flag. Of course, at 3A, there's so many references here in all of our national songs, but I will just mention, of course, the national anthem of F. Scott Key and 1814, and the Star-Spangled Banner. Obviously, the Star-Spangled Banner, I mean, you read these lines, you cannot help but think about those sets of lines, which leads us obviously to 3B and the conclusion of this poem. Where do you come down on this? When the national anthem is played, do you still find yourself passionate about the fact that you belong to this amazing country that Whitman will call a loftier country, a higher country, a better country, a country that transcended and included all things which came before it? Or do you find much of this rhetoric to be really kind of now too old and too impossible? I leave it to you. I hope that our reading of Leaves of Grass and Song of the Exposition has challenged you to be a greater citizen. Thank you.